We have an excellent panel here, very knowledgeable on a wide range of subjects associated with geospatial technology and policy and the applications. I will start out, Scott, with you. You asked what are the regulatory concerns that we should have we should be worried about with respect to, or what concerns should we have with respect to geospatial information that we need to have regulations? Do you have any particular ones that come to the top of your mind?
I think there's two errors, type 1, type 2, you can make. One is you can have too much information and too little. And the too little is fairly obvious. If we don't license systems and get the data available out there, if we don't distribute it, if it's not available and open and accessible. And so a lot of it is about, too little information, and gee, if we only had more. I would say one of the less recognized areas is going to be the issue of not necessarily too much information, but too much information in whose hands. And by that I mean the national security community, of course, already worries about, well, gee, if our enemies have this data or they could be this hostile exploitation. There's been that sort of concern. There's also the concern of, as it relates to privacy, again, we haven't talked a lot, but who owns geospatial data? They track wherever you're going, whatever time you're at. That's fine if you're looking to sell someone a shoe coupon, not so much if there's somebody else who's looking to do identity theft, on you. All these wonderful developmental goals back here all look, very objective, and we want to meet those developmental goals. But you can also imagine how technologies can be exploited by totalitarian regimes. You can just imagine that having geospatial data and a fully transparent system is a wonderful tool for an authoritarian government to have. If everyone can be tracked, everyone can be known, there is no place, in fact, that you can hide. So I think that the issue of regulation is, again, this issue of information control and power, and what the degree of accountability is there, and is that accountability provided by governments? Is it provided by market competition? How do we want to use this information? Because geospatial data is not valueless. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists to meet larger public needs or interests, and those can be good or for ill.
Kevin, you touched on that as well in terms of how the issue is becoming less of the aerospace issue and more about information itself, and how some of the challenge, that's a lot harder to do. Can you touch on some of the challenges that you're seeing with acres?
Sure. Again, I think the first challenge is how do you keep a regulatory environment moving that is really outstripped by technology? So when the current regulations were promulgated, there was never an idea of a CubeSat or a mini-sat or anything like that. And so how do you keep the regulations current while still maintaining the deliberate approach that a government has to take to thinking about trade-offs in this area? In terms of going from the aerospace technology, again, satellites and UAVs are clearly something derived from the military and intelligence world. How do we actually come up with an objective approach to thinking about how they can be used for a broader set of purposes? The history of the American space program is one which begins and is birthed deeply in the national security world, but then expands over time to the civil, environmental, and then commercial worlds. How do we accelerate that process, yet still maintain appropriate, whatever that means, security controls where they are needed to avoid some of the kinds of things Scott mentioned and even others?
Jerry, as a follow-up to that, Kevin had mentioned sort of 4 roles of government, and I think I have them here. I wrote them down if I can read my writing. As a customer, consumer, a patron, a regulator, or a competitor. As you're working on the platform and some of the work that you're doing, what role do you see yourself and your agencies playing, and how does that cause you to want to interact with the private sector?
Well, I mean, I think it's a mixture of, if not all, most of those roles, depending on the circumstance. I mentioned during my talk that one of the reasons that we're taking on this initiative, and one of the reasons that we've reconsidered the NSTI in the United States, is because of the changing role, of government in the ecosystem, and I think Kevin used the same word, the geospatial, community or the ecosystem of actors. you know, we really need, I think, to leverage what's happening in the private sector and to create an environment in which that innovation can happen. And that's a big part of what the open data initiatives are about. You know, how is it that we can publish government data, things that are collected as a public good with, you know, your tax dollars, and make them available for, you know, commercial entities to innovate and to build products on top of them. I think that's key to our shared success. I think, you know, the government benefits, you know, from many of those innovations and can take advantage of them. The regulatory issues are complex, and I think we're all trying to get our heads around, you know, some of the new technologies in particular. You mentioned small sats and drones, and I think, you know, we're kind of muddling, you know, through getting policies and regulatory, you know, frameworks in place that will help us address those things as government. But in any case, I think the role of patron, the role of customer, you know, the role of consumer of those services, and regulator are all, you know, parts of what we need to do as good government.
Hey, Kev, let me make one other point about that. I know there's been some discussion here about skills. The people that do those functions are not the same person. So the traditional R&D inventor, innovator in-house is typically not the best person to look outside of an agency for those innovations and understand the processes by which you harness that. And again, Nancy talked about some mechanism for showcasing these things to the government on a fairly rapid basis. They're typically very different skills that execute all those four functions.
That's an excellent point. Nancy, can you maybe expand a little bit on what you were talking about the role of industry to bring technology to the government, and then the government's, how it can structure itself to be receptive to that?
Sure, I would say two things. The first is that if you've ever talked to anyone who has an innovation and have tried to get it into a government office, or just the commercial weather providers who want to work more closely with NOAA, it's not an easy endeavor. And if you can't get NOAA to listen to you or to entertain your idea, what do you do? And so that makes you wonder how many other situations are like that in other parts of the government, whether it be national security or whatnot. So I do think that we should, as a government, as a nation, look at where's the best place to put an Office of Innovation. Is it an OSTP, or is it, you know, some other place? Is it the Commerce Department? But we don't have that mechanism right now, and SBIR certainly doesn't do it. And it's another one of those things that at this point in time, it's a void that we have to fill. And the other point I would make is, and just through a personal story, it's interesting because I think we do take for granted being here, and I'm just going to talk about this for the United States, about the impact of our data and our innovations. And last year, I was lucky enough to be at the World Parks Congress in Sydney, Australia. And NASA had a huge booth. They had their hyper wall there, and it's a whole wall of all of these televisions and screens rather, and they have like ocean surface winds, and they'll run it all on 10 screens. And it was amazing to me to watch like the indigenous, you know, Aboriginal park rangers come up and just look at their, you know, their land from a different perspective. And there was one image in particular that was a Landsat 8 image of the Mount Egmont in New Zealand. And like the New Zealand environmental minister she had never seen that image of the park, and it really shows you the islandization of the park. And so it's amazing to see how, as much as it's all available to us on a regular basis, we still have so much work to do to have these innovations reach some of the key people in other sectors.
Greg, I think that's a good segue into yourself. You mentioned working with the 3 to 4 billion people who are living in parts of the world where they don't have access to the technology, or they don't have access to being able to use it, or other aspects of this information. How can either the UN or industry or other governments from around the world sort of help introduce technology into those parts of the world, some of whom it's a significant change, but it allows them maybe to jump ahead 20 or 30 years rather than sort of a gradual development if it can be done.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just picking up on, just to continue from what Nancy was saying as well, we've also had the same challenge when we're talking with diplomats in the UN in New York. And these people are very smart people, they're very clever people, but their broad range of topics that they have to be across is unbelievable. And part of the challenge, and the fact is they just don't know what they don't know. And by just visualizing issues and problems to them, it makes an absolutely huge difference. And some of the examples that Nancy talks about is exactly how we took approaches to trying to give them an understanding of even what. Now, we didn't even use the word geospatial information in the video because that was too much. So we just stuck with geographic information because that kind of worked. As a separate issue, we also previously learnt a lot from when we were talking about geodesy and we were putting a resolution to the General Assembly. So we learnt a lot from that. But then there's the next part on, okay, how do you bring that to many of the developing countries around the world? And immediately when you start bringing capability and showing capability, and one of the ways that we tend to do it in the UN, because they'll say, can you give me an example? So we use case studies. We try and use exemplars of where geospatial information is able to answer problems and challenges. And I talked about one earlier today, just in our discussions on Earth observations around land management with Rwanda, that had used a fit-for-purpose process. But once other countries in Africa had seen that example of how you could take aerial imagery and Earth observation data, and they could actually, through local agreement, determine some of their land ownership and their boundaries and their land rights, it made a huge difference. And so it gives countries an idea, it gives them other ideas. We had the same issue when we were talking with Fiji in terms of a very proactive small island developing state, when with them it's as simple, and I will repeat this is exactly what was said, is that what they want to know is that, are they able to get coconuts out of their trees in the next 50 years? Are they able to sustain their fisheries in the next 50 years? Are they still going to have their villages on their islands in the next 50 years? And it's relating the science and things around sea level rise, climate change, and other data that we're familiar with. It's bringing them back to them. It's bringing it back to their local environment and applying it to their local environment. So the worst thing to do is say, well, look, up in the Arctic Circle or up in Europe, this is what's happening. That doesn't work. It's about saying, okay, this is how we're trying to do it in the Pacific. And then you start getting that engagement, and they're really eager to engage. But then the next question will always be is, okay, when can we have it? And that's where the policy process needs to be in place.
So Barb, there's been a lot of talk about partnerships and public-private partnerships today, and there seems to be a lot of benefit associated with that, and I think people here are familiar with that. But what are some of the challenges with that? Because I think those are the things that we're going to need to work through in the next stage in the development. What are some of the challenges that you see?
I would say the challenge that we GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, is facing right now with engagement with the private sector is that because we still are largely intergovernmental, so it's 98 member countries at the table, and the differences among those 98 member countries and how they interact with the private sector are so different that in many ways people are looking for either the lowest common denominator, or if you are advocating for a particular position, then you might be viewed as just advocating for your own national government's position. And so for us, that's why it's a little bit easier to work with associations like Nancy's or Jeff Sawyer's in Europe or Sanjay's, because whatever we offer to the private sector, we want to do it uniformly, transparently. And so that covers, say, the United States and Europe. But what about the private sector in Asia or Africa or South America. And so we're even having trouble finding associations of private sector entities to work with in those parts of the world. So I'd say some kind of harmonized approach globally to get people to take some chances is a challenge. And then, of course, just real quickly, we advocate there's probably no better organization to take some chances on than with GEO, because we aren't a UN organization. And so why don't countries kind of use us almost as a test bed to advance some of these things that then could be brought back to your respective countries? Because it's kind of a low risk, I would argue it's a low risk environment to push the envelope.
Scott, did you have a point about that?
Yeah. I wanted to make a plug for a different UN aspect, which is the long-term sustainability of space activities, which is an activity that's been going on within the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. It deals with things like orbital debris and space weather, and but also the contribution that space systems make to the sustainability in developing countries and regulatory affairs. And so I think there's probably a particular circle in hell to be in a UN regulatory subgroup, discussion. But one of the tensions there is between people who want to have uniform rules almost at a treaty level, that one size fits all applies to everybody, which almost never works, as opposed to different national approaches where national context can be taken into consideration. And one of the things that we talked a lot about in the regulatory group was some basic best practices in regulation, which sounds maybe very trite, but getting consensus on actually took some doing, which was, if you're going to regulate an industry, please talk to the industry first. Please talk to other people who have other experiences with that industry. The importance of taking into account things like sustainability over the longer term. So as more and more, as space technology becomes more globalized, there's a need for capacity building not only in the technical side of things, but also on the regulatory and the civil society side of things. And so I think we recognize that and pretty much have consensus within the UN structure on those kind of basic guidelines that I see as very complementary to and parallel with what you're doing in GEO.
Thank you. For those of us who just came back from the UN GGIM meeting, we saw the result of trying to impose a draft treaty without talking to industry or the community first, and how difficult or misguided you can be on that. Jerry, you have a lot of experience in trying to keep pace with technologies and industry's development. There's been a lot of conversation here about industries moves much more quickly than technology, and clearly you're trying with a platform and some of the things you're doing to keep pace with that. Can you tell us about some of the things, how you're doing that, how you're trying to keep up with the agility that we see with industry and technology?
Yeah, and two different ways to answer the question. One is the collaboration we've been trying to build through the National Geospatial Advisory Committee, which Kevin's been a member of, Mark Reichert has been a member of, and there may be others in the audience as well, which was a deliberate attempt by the federal government agencies to convene on a quarterly basis leaders in the national geospatial community from the public and private sectors. So I think there's been a lot of cross-fertilization, a lot of good discussion, and a lot of shared ideas that have come out of many of those discussions, which often results in policy advice being given to the government in terms of things we can do. So that's one kind of long-term, sustained activity that we've been taking on. I'd say the other is more bureaucratic, perhaps, and that's contract flexibility. I mean, we've been working really hard in our agency and my team to make sure that our procurement people are helping us, in this regard in terms of moving forward with innovation in the marketplace. And it means being less prescriptive about, what we're asking for in some cases, which makes, many government contract officers at all levels of government very nervous in some cases. But I think we're getting better at it as an organization. I'll use, our work in cloud computing as an example. And that's where we're trying to create a series, we're not asking for specific numbers of servers with these configurations. We're asking for capabilities. Here's the problem we're trying to solve, come back to us and create a contractual mechanism that allows us to let the experts in this area, our private sector innovators, propose solutions back to us, and not to be overly prescriptive. So I think there's recognition in the federal contracting ranks, and I suppose at other levels of government as well, that this is a problem that we're all faced with. And I think I've seen signs of good progress in some organizations, and ours is a work in progress. But I think we've done some good things lately.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer this, and if you could just give a high-level response. But when I think about and talk about data or information, I break it down into collection, processing, use, storage, and distribution. And I have my own personal bias, and particularly based on some of the things that we talked about here, as to where the logjam is in the geospatial community and where it's likely to be going forward. So, starting with you, Kevin, from your perspective, do we have the most friction at the collection, processing, use, storage, or distribution?
I'd actually argue, and I'm reflecting my own biases here as someone who runs a company focused on analysis, we've not yet struggled through the potential of analysis for certain data sets and applying rigorous methods to using the data. Okay, we're still sort of stumbling around how to bring diverse data sets together and actually making sense of them in a way that's useful to the policymakers that Greg's trying to deal with.
So does that mean that the data is there, but it's not of the particular quality, or is
Might be a quality issue, might just be a lack of ability to access different data sets that help you solve a particular problem.
So could that be sort of a process, in my sort of very
That's in
sort
the
of
process,
process,
yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
a processing type solution?
The processing to analysis
Right.
step
Okay.
there would be where I'd say the logjam is.
Okay. Barbara?
Yeah, boy, that is a good question because, well, I agree with that. I guess from maybe my perspective is on the distribution side. And I guess largely because of there's still many parts of the world that do not have broad open data policies for a lot of data that already exists. And then it's just maybe not in the form that's easily picked up. So I guess I'd have to say distribution.
Okay. Nancy?
I would first say that and I always characterize it as the environmental information supply chain is one that is very fragile, because I think any one of the points that you mentioned, we've not maximized really. And secondly, I would agree with Barb. I think that our biggest challenge is in the distribution or access and distribution of the data and information.
Okay. Thank you. Scott?
I would say systems tend to fail at the interfaces. And so it's not the technical side of anything. I think the primary challenge in the geospatial community is translation across very, very different cultural domains between the policy world and the legal world and the technical world. Even the nature of geospatial, which is very much an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary sort of activity, and therefore the barriers to utilizing and exploiting it, the blockage, if you will, is primarily internal mental models that people have. They think this is all about maps, or that this is about an aerospace technology, or this is about how much budget will my agency get, or how does this affect the power relationships in my country. And so it's really one of how can you translate from one community into another community as to what this means. So I would say interfaces is the barrier.
And it's hard for me to pick just one of those things as the biggest challenge. So I'll point out two. One is distribution, because I think, Barb, the problem's not just limited to other countries. I think it's different organizations, different groups inside the U.S., inside many national governments that do have strong open data policies. We're still leaving a lot of data left behind and locked in file cabinets unnecessarily. So I think distribution, we have big challenges to overcome. But ultimately, I do think it's use, and I like the way, that you put it in terms, Scott, in terms of thinking of, spatial thinking. How is it that people can ask the right questions, and how is it, to Kevin's point, that we have the analytical capabilities that live there, that are easily accessible by people who have those questions, who aren't GIS people or, remote sensing scientists. It was funny, years ago I was talking to someone about data.gov and, making all this data available to people. And his answer was very dismissive. And he said, come back to me when you have understanding.gov. I want to be able to ask questions, and give me knowledge from this. And it really, I think he's right. I mean, that is ultimately, as an industry and as a community, I think where we need to go. But we've got a lot of work to do, to get there.
I think I tend to agree with each of our answers here, but
He works for the UN.
another way of looking at it is almost like input versus output. So it was coming back to what's the problem statement, what's the need, what do we need to answer, and when do we need to answer it by, which means again about, I guess, an important part of that is the analysis and the integration and fusion. And then the outcome is then, how do we deliver that dissemination? So it's almost the two-way thing that we tend to have is people will say, well, what have you got? And we say, what do you want? What do you got? What do you want? And it's being able to say, okay, we can end-to-end solution some of those sorts of challenges.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for staying and enjoying this panel. And I think we have another panel after this, but I want to thank the speakers for what I thought was a fantastic program.